1, 2, yeah.
All right, good evening. Welcome to our October Veritas lecture. Glad to see you here on a beautiful day. You're allowed to check scores, during the presentation, not during the prayer service, but during the presentation. Our presenter this evening originally hails from Detroit, Michigan.
Detroit.
The Tigers won. You're right, Martha. The Tigers won. The Lions were not too bad either. So Dr. Wade Johnston, who in the year 2014 was our pulpit assistant once a month until we fired him after 9 months. Remember that? We fired him, so that was great. But now we let him come back every once in a while, including next Saturday. Dr. Johnston, Dr. Berg, and Professor Oakland presented at Wisconsin Lutheran College for a faculty gathering on the two kingdoms, a very timely subject for us here in our country. And they offered to bring that presentation here and to another one of our sister churches. So on Saturday, October 12th, you're invited, and it's a 3-hour presentation. I think we're going to break it up where kind of 15 minutes, take a 10-minute break. So come for 1 hour or come for all 3, but that's a week from Saturday. So Dr. Johnson's going to go to about 7:20-ish, and then we'll take a break, and those who want to stay for the prayer service are asked to move up to the first couple of rows for the prayer service. So, Wade, welcome.
All right, well, thank you for having me. It's good being back down here again. It's been a little while, but not too long. I want to start off by apologizing for how my colleague is dressed today. Looks like he's going to go hunting for golf balls. He's got camo shorts and the polo here, but that's all right. One of the nice things about McGuanago is I have several colleagues here who I'm sure they would tell you I spend a lot of time mentoring at the college. Probably one of the main formational figures in their lives and ministry. So it's nice to see them. But more seriously, the topic for tonight is, what does it mean to be justified? That term justify or justification is probably a term we hear a lot as Lutherans. It's a term we maybe could define if someone asked us, but what does it really mean besides, let's say, a catechism definition? Some of you might remember back to catechism class, right? Justification, to be justified. Maybe you learned to be declared not guilty. Maybe you learned a little bit cornier one, but it's not bad. Just as if I never sinned. The pastor did a little chuckle after he said that one, right? But what does it mean to be justified? More than just defining the term, but what does it mean to live as a justified Christian? This is really the word, the thing that everyone's seeking, whether they know that they're seeking it or not. That is to be justified, to be righteous, to be not guilty, to be right with others or with God, to feel whole. It's what people want. It's why they post on social media. It's why they mow their lawns. It's why they dress up for work or for church, unless they're Professor Oakland. It's why they do a lot of things to be justified, to be righteous. And so what does it mean to be justified? If we go to the next slide here. Really, if we're thinking about what it means to be justified, you sometimes hear young people, they'll say to each other, "You good, bro?" Right? Are you good? That's what it means to want to be justified. Am I good? I want to feel like I am good. I want others to think that I am good. I want to be good. Am I good? And so if we think of justification in that way, that might be a little helpful for as we go. And not just am I good, as in I'm not bad, but am I all right? Should I be happy? Should I be satisfied? Am I enough, right? Am I good, right? Like, are you good, bro? And if you think then before whom we try to be justified, that can be all different people. In my life, I want to be justified before my spouse. I want to be justified before my children. I want to be justified before my students. I want to be justified before my colleagues. I want to be justified before you here. I want you to hopefully like what I'm doing. And I do at the end of the night, when I think back on the day, I want to be justified before God. I want to think He's happy with me and I'm good with Him. So we can speak about many different justifications. But why is it, do you think, that humans want to be justified so badly? Why is this something everyone wants? You want someone to like your post. You want someone to comment on your work. You want someone to approve of your decision. Why do you think that is? Why is that such a human thing? What about maybe our creation would testify to this? If you think of how we came into being, if you think back to early Genesis, we were created right away in relationship. Adam was created in relationship. How? With whom was he in relationship right away? With God. And then God does this funny thing where He could have just told Adam, hey, like, you should really have someone else. But instead, God plays a little game with him, and He brings all the animals for him to name, which I always think had to be super fun for Adam, right? Imagine you got to name all the animals. Imagine you see an elephant and then a camel, right? You're going to have some fun with that. But He brings all the animals for Adam to name, and they're in pairs. And Adam, maybe, right, it seems he wasn't the quickest on the uptake, but eventually he realizes, how come I don't have a pair? And God says, okay, you're in relationship with me, and you're in relationship with creation. You've been naming it so you can interact with it. But now you're going to be in relationship with the woman as well. He creates Eve. And if you think of the fall into sin, it affects all of those relationships. All of those righteousnesses, all of those goods. First, Adam falls out of relationship with God. He hides from Him. He's ashamed. He knows he's naked. Then Adam blames God for the fall and says it's because God put who where? Put Eve in the garden. Essentially saying, God, remember how good it was when it was just you and me, man? Everything was wonderful. There was no death. And then you put her here. And then now what does Paul say in Romans? All creation sighs, it groans in eager expectation for the redemption that is to come. Even creation is subject to the fall. And so Oswald Bayer, a German theologian, he says, those who justify themselves are under compulsion to do so. There's no escape. We're social beings. We're socially vertically and we're socially horizontally, and we can't escape it. We want to be good. We want to be righteous. We want to be blameless in someone's sight. We want to be approved of. We want to be loved. So if we go ahead here, got it going already, excellent. If you think of the famous show, I grew up without cable. My parents were very cruel. So I only had network TV, right, which was probably good. I'd be even more brain dead than I am if I had had more channels. And Leave It to Beaver was always on. And if you think of Leave It to Beaver, how many people grew up thinking this was the ideal family, right? This is what you wanted to be like. And there's been kind of a shift, I think, in sitcoms to now the families are not the ideal families, right? And that's why we find them entertaining. But often it was, these families were presented and you wanted to be like that. They were presented as the ideal. And so even like, what was it, Eddie Haskell, right? The family of the Cleavers would kind of take him in and help straighten him out. And they were just like, the anchor for the neighborhood. And we want to be like that. And so often when we struggle, one of the thoughts that comes into our mind is, well, what will the neighbors think? Or what will people think? And so we try to keep up appearances. And why do we try to keep up appearances? It's not just to be hypocrites, but we try to keep up appearances because we want to be justified. We're afraid of what will happen if people only knew, because we know the way that we justify ourselves and others horizontally is based on these things. What people do, what they earn, what they say, how they present themselves if they mow their lawn. Can you tell I need to mow my lawn? And so we're trying to live up to something. We're trying to be something. This is why education is so important. You're teaching kids at a very young age what to live up and want to be, what to justify and what not to justify. So if we go ahead here, we have horizontal justification. And if you think about how you are justified before your neighbor, how do people justify themselves, or are they justified in the sight of their neighbors horizontally? What makes you say of a neighbor, they're a good neighbor? I had the neighbors next door. Abuela doesn't really speak any English, but she's just great. Abuelo speaks a little more, and they've got grandkids that live there. And Abraham Sanchez is like our adopted son. He's a little wild, but we've slowly been breaking him, right? Domesticating him. But when I was leaving, Daphne, her daughter, ran up and said, my grandma left something for you. And I said, oh, okay. And she said, but I don't know the word for it. She knew the word in Spanish and not in English. I said, well, okay. And then she went back, and they kind of went back and forth, well, what's the word? And then she figured out a cooler. And I realized, oh, there had been a cooler on our back porch. I thought one of my kids bought a cooler, which was odd because we have like 8,000 coolers. But that's a good neighbor. And we try to do stuff for them. And right, I would say, Abuela is a good neighbor. Hopefully she would say, we're a good neighbor. Maybe that's why she bought us the cooler, right? But what is it that determines those relationships if we think of someone as a good neighbor? What kinds of things? Yeah, do they seem to be trustworthy, honorable? Do they value the same things? Very good. Yeah, do they do nice things for you? We don't get pies, but we get churros. All of these things are nice things, but notice they're all in the realm of activity. They're all in the realm of doing. And if they're all in the realm of doing, that means they're all in the realm of the law. And that doesn't mean they're bad, but that means they're based on reciprocity. They're based on quid pro quo. They're based on mutual interests, right? I tend to have people do nice things for me when I do nice things for them. It tends to work. And I tend to want to do nice things for people when they do nice things for me. And that's wonderful. And that's how you get along with the neighborhood. And that's how society operates well, and we give thanks for that. But would you say that is an active or passive righteousness? Is that someone being justified simply they receive this justification that they're good, or is that someone earning it? Yeah, it's active. It's earned, right? And so when we're talking horizontal, we're talking about law-based, legal, active justification, active goodness, which again is not bad, but we're going to ask if that's ultimately what's going to work with God. So if we're using the law horizontally, and that's all we really have to go on, then it's going to be an act of righteousness. And why can horizontal righteousness, my life with my neighbor, why can it, apart from Christ, only be law-based? Yeah, it's natural human interaction. It's rooted in what we do. And doing is the realm of the law. That's not to say no one can just love to love. Sometimes that happens, but the Bible says it's pretty hard, right? Sometimes someone will lay down their life for a brother, but it wouldn't be the stuff of movies and news stories if it happened all the time. So if we go to the next slide then, think of the Old Testament. And if the Bible were a book that showed you how to be righteous actively, that showed you how to be justified by doing things, boy, oh boy, would these patriarchs be the perfect examples. But I want you to take a moment, and you can do this with your neighbor if you want, or you can do it by yourself if you're introverted or don't like the person you're sitting next to. Carrie, that probably means you. So if you want to take a moment and think of some of the Old Testament patriarchs or biblical kings, the good kings, we'll say. What are some of the things from their life that we know from the Bible that would make them problematic? Pick someone, and you can talk about the good, but also talk about, but they also did this or that. Go ahead and have at it a little. All right, did anybody have any names jump right to mind? Moses, yeah, this is a great one. Moses, man, we just had a couple weeks ago in the reading that Moses is a humble man, and Aaron and Miriam speak against him, undermine his ministry, and yet he prays for Miriam to be healed when she gets leprosy. What a wonderful believer. But also, what do we know about Moses? He was a murderer. And he grumbled against God, so he doesn't get to enter the promised land. Who would be another one? David, yeah. I remember reading through the Psalms when I was debating if I'd become Lutheran or not. I had two columns. I had one for the Roman Catholic side, one for the Lutheran side. And I probably something that worked in the favor of the Lutheran side, but I didn't realize it was doing that at the time, was reading through David's Psalms. And he keeps talking about how he's blameless. And I just remember going, dude, everyone knows what you did. But how can you say you're blameless? Like, it's all in the Bible, man. It's not hidden. Right? What are some of David's sins? You know some of them off the top of your head. Adultery. He has Uriah murdered. Right? We could go on with some more. And yet David can say he's blameless. Maybe another one? Solomon, yeah. Solomon starts off great, doesn't he? And he's got this wisdom. And then we see he ends up chasing after foreign influences. Abraham, we always remember the sacrifice, but we don't remember twice. He says that Sarah is just his sister, which sets her up to be someone else's wife because he's afraid he might get killed or something. We forget about Hagar and Ishmael, right, where he's going to help God along. My favorite, my personal favorite, is Noah. Man, Noah, he's the closest in the Bible in the Old Testament probably to just a guy who did everything right, except Moses includes one little story. Noah does everything great. They come through the flood. Noah offers sacrifice. Man, he's killing it. And then what does he do one day? He gets drunk and passes out naked. This is an old man. And then his son comes in and sees him and says, I'm going to make this go viral. All 8 people in the world are going to know about this, right? And his other 2 sons come in and they walk in backwards and they cover him because what does love do? Love covers a multitude of sins. And yet all these people are commended in the Bible. Think of the Hebrews 11, the Hall of Fame of faith, and they're commended. Well, why then doesn't the Bible hide their faults? Why doesn't the Bible hide their warts? And if it doesn't, what is that teaching about how we're righteous before God? Right? What is David teaching when he can write Psalm 32 and 51 where he's like, man, my sins were terrible. I couldn't sleep. I was sore all the time. I just, life was bad. But then I forgave. And then at the end he's like, and now I'm going to teach sinners God's way. What is this telling us then? Is this righteousness the same as the horizontal righteousness we were just talking about? If it were, they would not have been in great shape with God. And so we have to continue on and think about then, well, what is righteousness? And so Jesus tells this famous parable, right? And most of us know this parable probably. And the question is, how is one justified? And we sometimes read this not very well because we're hard on the Pharisee, because we're programmed to be hard on the Pharisee. Right? Even the word Pharisee we often take in a negative way, even though some of the Pharisees were believers. Right? But the Pharisee was the one whose religion most people in the world share. Right? That you're good based on what you do. And so we get the parable, and the two men go up into the temple to pray. One's a Pharisee and one's a tax collector. And the Pharisee stands by himself, right, because he is off to pray, and he doesn't want to be associated with the public sinners. And he prays. I like to talk about this as being an Ozzy Osbourne praise song. I, Bono, right? I thank you that I'm not like other men, and he even lists some, and then he says, even like this tax collector. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says in his Life Together that self-justification leads to sinful judgment about others, while justification by grace leads to graciousness and service to others. Why does it make sense that if one thinks they have to justify themselves, they're also going to sinfully judge others? It's the most natural thing in the world. Why would that be? Yeah. If I'm going to justify myself by law, then law is a comparative thing. I'm either better or worse than someone. This is, a lot of people think they're going to heaven because at least they aren't Hitler. Right? In seminary, I used to joke when it was time to take pictures. Synod always likes to take pictures of you at seminary. The easiest way to lose weight was to stand next to a fatter guy. What was the easiest way to get taller? Stand next to a shorter guy. What was the easiest way to get more handsome? Stand next to an uglier guy. Now, thankfully, at seminary, we had all those guys, right? And that was my friend circle. I'm just joking. I always joke, seminary is a unique place because seminary is where most of us who are seminarians is the only place we got a chance to be cool, right? We weren't going to be cool anywhere else, so this is where we have to try it. But what is that? We can go back for a second. Sorry. What's natural then is for the Pharisee to say, I'm better than this tax collector. Because he was. And the people watching would have known he was. This was the all-star team of religion. This is the people you look to be like. And we all do the same, we just don't say it. We all sometimes comfort ourselves by comparison. Well, I might not be a perfect parent, but at least I'm not so-and-so. I might not be the perfect teacher or professor, but at least I'm not so-and-so. I might not be the best at work, but at least I'm not so-and-so. And everyone at work knows who so-and-so is, right? They're usually the ones getting promoted. But we default to comparison if justification is going to be by the law, which is why Jesus has to say in the Sermon on the Mount, not, be ye better than other people, as your Father in heaven is better than other people, but be ye perfect. And so the tax collector knows he's not been perfect. And the tax collector had multiple knocks against him. Tax collectors still aren't popular today for the most part. My wife went back to school for an accounting degree. I was kind of hoping she'd get a job at the IRS so I could say that I eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners, but she didn't. But tax collectors not only were collecting taxes, which was unpopular, but they were collecting taxes for whom? Themselves and the Romans. They would bid, I can get this much out of my neighbors. And the Romans would say, okay, but you'd only bid that much because you knew you could get more. There was no set flat tax or anything like that. And so they were enemies of their own people. And many would have thought they were enemies of God because the Romans were occupying the Holy Land. And so this tax collector had to be thinking, I've got no shot, but I'll try. And so what are we told about the tax collector? He stands far off like a good Lutheran. He's in the back pew, right? And what does he do? He beat his breast saying, God be merciful to me, a sinner. What does it mean for God to be merciful? God, you can only be merciful to someone who has faults. What does it mean to be merciful? Grace is giving someone what they don't deserve. What's mercy? Not giving someone what they do deserve. It's confessing his sins. And Jesus says something that at the time would have been scandalous. Like some people there would have been outraged. He says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Well, self-justification is the definition of exalting yourself. It's trying to build yourself up in God's eyes. It's trying to make yourself bigger and better than you are. And God sees right through it. God knows better. So we'll go on here. So now we got to talk about vertical justification. And how do people naturally think they're going to obtain righteousness before God? Most people, their default's going to be what? How do they get righteousness? How do they become good? How are they justified before God? Yeah, the same way they're justified before everyone else. The same way it works for every other relationship in their life. Think, well, it must work that way. Why doesn't that work? Yeah. We're imperfect beings. And I might get by with comparison to other fallen sinners, but I can never stand up in comparison to God. I'm never going to be that good. So this presents a real problem. The question of, well, how does God judge or justify the sinner? And is this righteousness active or passive? Well, why can't it be active? Why can't it be law justification? Is the problem the law? Is the law bad? No, Jesus didn't throw out the law. He fulfilled it, right? Well, if the problem's not the law, what's the problem? Is the basketball bad? Yeah, we can't keep it. A basketball's a good thing, but if you tell me to dunk a basketball, it's not happening. It never was happening, and it's happening even less now. I have a pretty impressive vertical. It's about that right there. But I can't even touch net. Well, the law is not bad, but I can't do with the law what I want to do with the law. And we all know that, at least in the honest hours. At least in the honest hours. And God knows that for sure. And so this is going to have to be a passive righteousness. Well, what does that look like? What does that mean? We'll go ahead and take another biblical example. We'll take Abraham. So Paul was arguing with some people that were called Judaizers, and they had followed him to some congregations, and they had said, what Paul taught was great, but he didn't tell you everything. There's a few rules you also have to keep to be Christians. And what was the big one? Circumcision. It makes sense that the Jews would struggle with this because they had done this for centuries. This had marked them as a special people. Now, it was supposed to be a reminder that the Messiah would come from their line. Every time a Jewish couple was intimate, they were reminded a Jew someday would be Messiah. And then he'd come. And there wasn't that reason for that anymore, or the sacrifices in the temple, or the dietary laws. You can follow kosher dietary laws if you want. They're pretty healthy, but you're going to miss bacon, right, which is pretty good. Well, Paul's dealing with that, and so he's writing to Rome, and he had never been to the Roman congregation. This was not a church he founded. And there's all kinds of house churches in Rome, and some are more Jewish, some are more Gentile, meaning they come from a pagan past, and this is like an introductory letter. And Romans is so long for an ancient letter. Like, this is the equivalent of getting a text message that doesn't all fit on your phone at once. And you just go, oh. He keeps scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. He goes on for 16 chapters. And he's really writing a catechism for them. This is the Christian faith. And he gets there already in chapter 4 now to Abraham. And he picks Abraham for good reason. The Jews considered Abraham to be their father. And Paul says, Abraham is your father. But he's not your father for the reason you think. He's not your father according to DNA. I mean, he is, but that's not the most important reason. He's your father according to faith. And he's the Gentiles' father too. And the Jews had looked to that Mosaic law. We talked about Moses and said, the law says do this and you'll live, so I must be able to do it and live. And many of them had grown up then with the expectation that you could get vertical righteousness also by activity. And Paul says, no, Abraham, your father of the Jewish people, was not saved by that covenant. He was saved by the first covenant. And what was the first covenant? It was the gospel. It was promise. And so Paul says to them, Abraham, verse 11, received the sign of circumcision afterwards as a seal of the righteousness that he already had by faith while he was still circumcised. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. All the Old Testament patriarchs were Christians. They were waiting for the coming Christ who would take their sin away. They were believers. Why else would you do all the crazy stuff they did? Why would you spend your whole life wandering if you didn't have a reason? What they had was a promise. And a promise has nothing to do with works. If it has to do with works, that's a contract. God doesn't make contracts with us. Car dealers make contracts with us. Cell phone companies make contracts with us. God gives promises, and there's only one thing to do in response to a promise, and what is that? You can believe it or not believe it. You can believe it or not believe it. And if it's a promise and it's simply trust, then it's passive. It's simply received. And so we'll continue on here. So Christ's saving work breaks down into three parts. Well, what has Jesus done for me? First, Jesus fulfills the law. He doesn't say it's bad. He doesn't take it away in that way. He doesn't say the law, you shouldn't pay any attention to it, but he fulfills it. He says, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and fulfill this, so you stop trying. And now you can just do the law. You can stop trying to fulfill it to be righteous. You can be righteous through faith, and you can just do the law because it's good for your neighbor, and because you're going to actually start to like it when you do it in freedom and in love. And then he takes away our sin. He says, okay, all that stuff that the law says you have, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to need that now. And I'm going to take that and I'm going to nail it to the tree of the cross. And you remember your sin, but God doesn't. I always love this about confession and absolution. You might go and confess your sin to your pastor or a fellow Christian, and that's good to do. I hope you do sometimes. Sometimes actually saying the sin out loud takes away its power over you. But when you confess to God, God's like, what are you even talking about? He has no clue, because he already forgot that sin at Calvary. And on Easter Sunday, you know your sins better than God does. Isn't that crazy? So he takes your sin, and now he imputes, he gives to you righteousness. Think of your favorite present you got as a kid at Christmas. What would you have said if one of your friends said, that's not really yours, someone gave that to you? That video game's not yours, someone gave it to you. You'd think I'm a fool, wouldn't you? You'd say, yeah, it's mine, it was a gift, but it's mine. Well, that's the case with our righteousness too. Sometimes there's some religions and even some in Christianity who would say, well, that's not real, that's fake righteousness because you didn't earn it. Well, there's lots of things I didn't earn. There's lots of things I've just been gifted in life. It doesn't mean they're not mine. In fact, that even makes them more precious. Right? You remember that gift, you remember that feeling that grandma gave you or your mom gave you or your crazy uncle or whoever who gave you Maybe they gave you like fireworks you weren't supposed to have, or a BB gun or something. It was the best thing ever. But that it's a gift doesn't make it fake. And so Jesus also uses this picture of Abraham, and he says in verse 34 that truly, truly I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. So if you're under the law, you're going to sin. You're going to be a slave to sin. It's all you can do. The slave does not remain in the house forever. The son, though, remains forever. He's the heir. The son gets the thing, and what has the son done? The son has set you free. In the ancient world, the son owned the slave. He could do what he wanted. And the son has set you free. He's set you free from the law. You're not now living under that law so that God will love you. What kind of lousy father only loves their kids when they do the right things? You're now free to love your neighbor and your father because you know you're loved. Kids do better that way, by the way. When they know they're loved, they're able to flourish. And the same is true here. So what does this mean for me? God removes the law as a metric for salvation. It's just not how God views me. He's not holding scales to decide if he loves me today based on if there's more good than bad. Now, what's the great temptation if you hear me say that? What do you get afraid people are going to do now? They're going to sin, right? Guess what they're going to do even if they don't have the gospel? They're going to sin. Here's a little secret. Guess what sinners do? Sin. If we think we're going to get rid of sin by the law, no, Paul says that the law increases sin. Why? Because it teaches me what sin is. It exposes sin. Now, maybe, just maybe, I might be able to sin less, not because I get better at the law, but because I'm just set free to enjoy life as a gift and see my neighbor as someone to be loved. I can help them not to get something out of it, to score points with God, but just because they need help. I can be confident in the grace in which I now stand. And so he removes the law as a metric for salvation. Oh, that should say guilt, not guild. That's not a medieval association of craftsmen. Pastor Borland told me he was going to proofread this for me. Jesus absolves guilt and shame, and those are two different things. In the West, we're pretty good at guilt, not as good at shame, although we're getting better at shame with cancel culture stuff. The Bible talks about guilt and shame. So guilt, what do we tend to think of when we hear the word guilt? You do something bad, and then how do you feel? You feel bad. We tend to think of guilt, okay, I feel bad. And that's one side of things, but it also brings shame. And what's shame? Well, shame is now I'm embarrassed in front of others or God. And that we somewhat are, but sometimes I think the prophet's words to Israel, they've forgotten how to blush, can be true of us now today too. There's some ways in which our society's just forgotten how to blush. We're not embarrassed. Many languages do better with guilt and shame than English. They combine them. We used to have a German professor at the college, just a wonderful woman. I used to audit German to stay up with her, Frau Krause. And next to the Modern Languages building, there was 2 parking spots for the faculty there. And sometimes a student would park there, and she would write a little sign that says, "Shame on you." And I knew she was thinking the German Schaden. And German shame is next level shame. That's like, you should feel really bad, but also be embarrassed around other people that you've done this thing. And we see both at play in the Bible. Someone was clean or unclean. And if you were unclean, you weren't in right relationship with God or horizontally with neighbors. And Jesus takes away both. Think of how often he heals someone in the Bible, and then he gives them back to their family or to society. He heals the lepers and say, "Go show yourself to the priests." Why? So they can now be in community. He heals Jairus' daughter, and then he gives her back and says, "Hey, have some dinner with her." Why? Because being dead apparently makes you hungry, right? But gives her back to her family. He does this again and again. And then, so Jesus restores us to community, both vertical and horizontal. So Bonhoeffer has this great quote, "Christ opened up the way to God and to one another." We tend to be really good at Christ opened up the way to God. I'm guessing you don't hear many sermons here on a Sunday that don't talk about Christ having opened up the way to God, that God loves you and forgives you in Christ. I've never been down here and not heard that. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I had this guy preach. I'll stop. Okay. It just makes it easy. Okay. But what about opens the way to my neighbor? What do you think he means by that? How does Christ open the way to my neighbor? Why does Professor Oakland let me joke so much as I do? Some might say a little cruelly sometimes. It's because he's a better Christian than me. He knows this. How does it open the way to neighbor? What does it recognize as an essential part of relationship? Forgiveness, grace, mercy. You don't have a meaningful relationship in life if it hasn't had those things. Whenever a couple in the parish would tell me they never fight, I never believed them. And if they were telling the truth, I half expected them to find them on the news someday with one of them found in a freezer. Right? Maybe someone never fights, but most people are going to fight. Marriage is two sinners. Someone told me their kids never talk back to them or said they hate them or that you're the worst. I wouldn't believe them. In fact, my one, she would love to say she hated me, and I knew how to make her even worse. I'd say, "Well, I love you." She said, "Well, I hate you." "Well, I love you." I learned this from Jesus. What did Jesus say? Love your enemies, and in so doing, you'll heap burning coals upon their head. It was fun. I was trolling her, right? I loved and forgave her. When my kids are older, they're going to have to love and forgive me for a lot of things that they process, right? We all do that. We get older and we have to come to terms with our parents who are people like us. And we learn that because we become parents and we realize, ooh, this is a hard thing to do. You come here to church and it's full of sinners. Kind of like the hospital's full of sick people. And sinners sin, and it turns out your pastors are sinners, and it turns out for them their lay people are sinners. But the way is open to neighbor when you're not judging your neighbor according to justification, self-justification, but in grace. And so even when you have to use the law, when you warn them of sin, you're doing it so they can be restored in the gospel. And you can only do that if you understand passive righteousness. If you understand that true love, justifying love, God's love, loves to love, not because it's earned. So what does Paul say? He tells the Colossians, "For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God." We want to get to the point where we're good Christians who can show it off. We want people to be impressed with our piety. We want to be able to keep up appearances. We want leave it to beaver. But sometimes we know it's not who we are. We struggle. We fall. And so our life is hidden. God says, "What are you talking about? You're perfect. I don't see any sin." Well, our life is hidden. It's not hidden from God. It's hidden sometimes from me. And my neighbor's life in Christ is sometimes hidden from me. And yet that doesn't mean it's not real. They're righteous with the same righteousness I have. They're righteous in Christ. And so we've got this long parable Jesus tells that a lot of people really don't like this parable. I think it's fun. I really enjoy it. So I got what, John, I got 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Okay. Why don't you, just with your someone around you or by yourself, give that a quick read, and then I'll rather than me trying to read it all to you. while you finish up. For those listening, I don't know if they can see the slide, so I'll give the quick breakdown. There's this master. He gives his servants, he has to go away. He's supposed to be crowned king. He gives 3 of his servants a different number of minas or minas, however you want to pronounce this here. I'm going to say minas. I like the sound of it. And one gets 2 invest, 1 doesn't. As he's going to be made king, he's rejected by the people there, and he comes back and he finds out 2 of them kind of invested crazily and did really well, and 1 basically buried his treasure and made nothing. And so how most of you have made it through here now, this is kind of like the parable of the dishonest manager. People really struggle with that one. I like that one too. But how do you think most people take this? Especially if they've just had a stewardship Sunday. Then what's the lesson of this? God wants you to use your time and talents and treasures for Him. And that's not bad, but that's law, and law is the opposite of what Jesus is doing here. In fact, the guy who gets in trouble gets in trouble because he could only think in law. The first guy says what? Man, I went and bought Bitcoin. I figured, hey, you're giving me this, I might as well do something with it. You're an understanding dude. I knew you wouldn't get mad. Nah, I made 10. And the other guy says, you know what, I went to the horse track. You don't make 10 to 1, 5 to 1. You don't just make that easily. I went to the horse track because I knew you'd understand if I lost. And you know what, I really like this one horse's name. And man, he came in. You should have seen it. It was a great race. And what does the last one say? Why didn't he invest? I knew you are a severe master. You take what you did not deposit and reap what you did not sow. I knew you were a law father. I knew you were out to get me. I knew you were going to keep points. And if I failed, you would have punished me. You would have been done with me. The third man doesn't have faith. The third man thought he had to justify himself. The third one thought he had to come up with his value before the master, somehow earn it. And here we have this master, and Jesus is telling this parable right during his passion, Luke 19. And he goes off to be king, and the people don't want him. Sound familiar? And he comes, and there's these 2 that are just so happy to say, man, you're the best. You gave us this stuff, and we just had fun with it. And that's what the gospel does. That's what it means to be justified. It's being able to say, you know what, you love me, God, and I might not do everything perfectly, and things might not go exactly how I planned. But you know what, I'm going to do things because I'm set free to do them for you, and so I'm going to do them for my neighbor, and I'm going to enjoy the gifts that you give me, and you're set free to do that. Rather than what comes of the law thinking, being paralyzed by fear. Will I help my neighbor good enough? Will I love my family well enough? And so you do nothing at all. What does it mean to be justified? It means to be set free to live. Because you don't have to keep points. You don't have to always be comparing. You have a passive righteousness. You have a gifted righteousness. You have a Father who loves you because He does. And so should you use your times, talents, and treasures wisely? Of course. That's why God gave them to you. But should you use them so He'll love you? So you'll get to heaven? So you'll count? So you'll be enough? So you'll be good? No. How does Jesus say you get good fruit? What produces good fruit? A good tree. God makes good trees, and He's made you good trees. And so He sits back and He waits for the fruit. And for that we can rejoice, and in that we can be at peace. And that's at the end of the day what it means to be justified. So I see Pastor Borland's on the move. I'll go ahead and leave off there. I don't know if you want any time for questions or not, or...
Yeah, there's a few minutes for questions if you want to just point them out. If people have questions for Pastor Johnston.
Oh man, I was that clear. All good?
Let's thank Pastor